There was a time in this country when a man knew what to share in public and what to keep behind his own front door. He understood that the private life of his wife was not his story to tell. He understood that the things she did in the quiet hours of the night, the things she did when nobody else was watching, the things she did when she thought she was alone, those things belonged to her. They were not currency for him to spend in front of his friends, or his co-workers, or 200 strangers in a studio audience. But what happened on Family Feud one cool Thursday morning in early March would prove that some men have lost that understanding entirely. And when 3-year-old Reginald Crawford leaned into a microphone on a stage in Atlanta and casually revealed something about his wife that he had no business revealing, Steve Harvey did something that even his the camera crew had never seen him do before. He froze. He stood completely still in the middle of the stage for almost 11 seconds. He did not blink. He did not breathe. And when he finally moved again, he did something that would become one of the most talked about moments of that entire season. Her name was Yvette Crawford. She was 50 years old. She worked the early shift as a registered nurse in the labor and delivery unit at a busy public hospital in the city of Baltimore, Maryland, and she had been married to Reginald Crawford for the past 24 years. She was the mother of 3 children, 2 grown daughters and a teenage son, and she was, by every measure that her co-workers and her patients would later use to describe her, one of the kindest and most private women they had ever met. She was the kind of woman who delivered other people's babies at 3 o'clock in the morning and then came home and made her own family breakfast at 6. She was the kind of woman who carried her own small sorrows in her own small purse and never once asked anybody else to carry them for her. And she was the kind of woman who, on the night before that Thursday morning taping, had done something so deeply private, so deeply hers, that her husband should have understood, on every level of decency a husband can understand, that it was not his to share. The Crawford family from Baltimore faced off against the Henley family from Phoenix. The Crawfords had been winning. The Crawfords had been laughing. Reginald, an associate pastor at a mid-sized Baptist church in Baltimore, had been working the audience the way pastors work, a congregation, smiling, joking, leaning into the microphone with that easy confidence men of his profession often have. Yvette had stood quietly on the far end of the lineup in a soft lavender dress, smiling the small, careful smile she had been perfecting for 24 years. Nobody in that studio could have known what was coming. Nobody could have known that within the next 6 minutes, Reginald Crawford was going to take something that belonged to his wife, hold it up in front of millions of people, and watch the man holding the microphone freeze in front of him. To understand the weight of what happened on that stage, you have to understand who Yvette Crawford really was. She had been born in 1974 in a small working-class neighborhood on the east side of Baltimore, the daughter of a city bus driver and a hospital cafeteria worker. Her mother had been a quiet woman herself, the kind of woman who prayed every morning at the kitchen table before anybody else in the house was awake, and who had taught Yvette, from the time she was very small, that there were 2 kinds of things in a person's life. There were the things you carried in your hands, which everybody could see, and there were the things you carried in your heart, which only God needed to see. Yvette had grown up believing that distinction with the kind of belief that does not waver. She had carried her hand things openly, her schoolwork, her nursing degree, her marriage, her children, her job at the hospital, and she had carried her heart things quietly, the way her mother had taught her, the way her grandmother before that had taught her mother. She had met Reginald Crawford in 1999 at a young adult Bible study at a small Baptist church in West Baltimore. Reginald had been 27 then, a few years out of seminary, working as a youth pastor at the church and going to school, part-time for his master's degree. He had been confident in a way that Yvette had found magnetic at the time, the kind of confidence that filled a room and that made people lean forward when he spoke. He had quoted scripture easily. He had laughed easily. He had asked Yvette to coffee after Bible study one Wednesday evening, and within 8 months, they were engaged. They were married, in the spring of 2000, in the same church where they had met, with Reginald's seminary mentor officiating and Yvette's mother weeping quietly in the front pew. Their first daughter, Simone, was born in 2002. Their second daughter, Naomi, in 2005. Their son, Christopher, in 2008. Reginald had risen through the ranks of his church over the next 2 decades. He had moved from youth pastor to associate pastor, to executive associate pastor. And by 2018, he was the second most senior staff member at one of the largest Black Baptist congregations in Baltimore. He was respected in the community. He was invited to speak at other churches across the city. He was on the board of 2 local nonprofits. He was the kind of man people pointed to as an example of what a Christian husband and father should look like. And in the public eye, that was exactly what he was. He brought his family to the front pew every Sunday. He prayed over his children at the dinner table. He told stories about Yvette from the pulpit, gentle stories, funny stories, stories that always painted her as the steady, supportive wife of a busy ministry man. The congregation loved her. They loved her without ever really knowing her, because Reginald did most of the talking for both of them. But there was something Reginald had been doing for the last 6 years that Yvette had asked him more than once to stop doing. He had been using her in his sermons, not in the gentle, anonymous way that most pastors use their wives. With a quick anecdote here and a passing reference there, he had been using her in specific, identifying ways. He had told the congregation about a miscarriage she had suffered in 2014. He had told them about a depression she had quietly battled in 2017 after her mother's death. He had told them about a conversation she had had with her sister about her own faith during a difficult winter in 2020. Each time, Reginald had framed these revelations as testimony, as evidence of God's faithfulness, as proof of his family's spiritual resilience. And each time, Yvette had sat in the front pew with her hands folded in her lap, smiling the small, careful smile, while her most private moments were narrated to a room of 800 people who would then approach her in the lobby afterward to tell her how brave she was. Yvette had asked him 3 separate times, in the quiet of their own bedroom, to stop. The first time, in 2018, she had asked gently, the way her mother had taught her to ask things. "Reginald," she had said, "those stories are mine. Please do not tell them without asking me first." Reginald had apologized. He had said he had not realized. He had promised he would be more careful. The second time, in 2020, she had asked more firmly. Reginald had told her she was being too sensitive, that her testimony was a gift to the church, that she was hiding her light under a bushel. He had said it in the gentle, slightly disappointed voice he used when he wanted her to feel like she was failing some quiet test of Christian womanhood. The third time, in 2022, Yvette had not asked. She had told. She had said, "Reginald, the next time you use one of my private stories in a sermon without asking me first, I'm going to walk out of the sanctuary. I do not care who is watching." Reginald had told her she was being dramatic. He had not stopped. He had simply gotten more careful about which stories he chose. He had stopped naming the specific years. He had stopped using the word miscarriage, but he had not stopped. The night before the Family Feud taping, in a hotel room in Atlanta with the curtains drawn against the city lights, Yvette Crawford had done something she had not told a single living soul about. Not her sister, not her best friend from nursing school, not her 2 grown daughters. She had pulled a small notebook out of her purse, sat down at the small desk by the window, and started writing the first page of a letter to her husband. The letter was not finished. She had written for almost 2 hours, in her careful nurse's handwriting, and then she had folded the pages, slipped them back into the notebook, and put the notebook back into her purse. The letter was a letter of separation. It was not a divorce letter, not yet. It was a letter telling Reginald that she had decided, after 24 years, that she was going to move out of their house at the end of the school year, after Christopher graduated from high school in June. She had decided that she could no longer be married to a man who used her private life as raw material for his Sunday morning sermons. She had not told him yet. She had been planning to tell him quietly, on a Sunday afternoon in late March. After she had finished writing the letter and had time to read it back to herself once or twice, she had not planned to tell anybody on a stage in front of cameras. She had not planned anything to happen on a stage at all, but what Reginald Crawford was about to do on that stage would take the decision entirely out of Yvette's hands. The first 2 rounds had gone smoothly. Reginald had been on fire. He had answered the toss-up questions quickly. He had cracked a joke about church potlucks that had made Steve Harvey laugh until he had to wipe his eyes. He had thrown his arm around Yvette's shoulders twice for the cameras, and Yvette had smiled the small, careful smile she had been perfecting for 24 years. The Crawford family was leading by 40 points going into the 3rd round. The audience was warming to Reginald. Steve Harvey was clearly enjoying the energy he was getting from the associate pastor. Then came the question. Steve turned to the screen and read it out loud. "We surveyed 100 husbands. Name something your wife did in the last 24 hours that surprised you. The audience laughed. The Henley family across the stage started whispering and grinning. Reginald, who had won the buzzer with a fast answer, leaned into his microphone with that easy associate pastor grin he had been wearing all morning. Steve, Reginald said, I have a good one. Last night in our hotel room, my wife stayed up late writing in a notebook. Now, this woman never journals. Never has. So when I woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning and saw her sitting at that little desk by the window, writing away, I asked her what she was working on. And you know what she told me, Steve? She told me she was writing me a letter. Now, in 24 years of marriage, my wife has never written me a letter. Not one. So I am thinking, oh boy, what could this be? I read it this morning when she was... The audience laughed nervously, sensing the energy of the joke but not quite sure where it was going. Reginald grinned at the cameras. Apparently, my wife has decided she is going to move out of our house in June. 24 years of marriage, and she finds out about this on a game show. Reginald laughed. He laughed like it was the funniest thing he had ever said. He turned and looked at Yvette with an exaggerated wink, the same wink he had given her 2 rounds earlier. And then he reached up and tapped the side of his own head with his finger, the universal gesture for, "Can you believe this woman?" The audience did not laugh. It was the kind of silence that always not happen on a daytime game show. The kind of silence that happens when 200 people in a room realize at the exact same moment that they have just witnessed something none of them were supposed to see. The Henley family across the stage went still. The Crawford daughters, Simone and Naomi, standing on the lineup next to their father, slowly turned their heads to look at their mother. Christopher, the 16-year-old son on the far end of the lineup, dropped his hands from the microphone stand. He was looking at his mother, too. They had not known. None of the 3 Crawford children had known. They were finding out at the same time as the live studio audience and the future viewers at home. Yvette Crawford did not move. She stood completely still on her end of the lineup, the small, careful smile still on her face, her hands folded in front of her the way her mother had taught her to fold them, in church. But all the color had drained out of her face. Her eyes had gone glassy, the camera zoomed in on her face. She looked in that moment less like a woman and more like a photograph of one. Steve Harvey was standing in the center of the stage holding his blue card. He had been about to laugh along with Reginald's setup. He had been about to deliver one of his classic, Steve Harvey, reactions, the kind of slow burn comedic take that had made him famous. But as Reginald reached the punchline and tapped the side of his own head, Steve Harvey did something that even his longtime production crew had never seen him do before. He stopped. He stopped completely. He did not raise his eyebrows. He did not roll his eyes. He did not look at the camera. He simply froze in the exact position he had been in, with the blue card halfway raised. His head turned slightly toward Reginald, his mouth slightly open. And he stayed like that for almost 11 full seconds. 11 seconds is not a long time in normal life. But on a television stage with cameras rolling and 200 people watching, 11 seconds is an eternity. The studio went so quiet that the audience could hear the air conditioning system in the tour ceiling. The production crew in the booth above the stage held their breath. The director did not call for a cut. The cameras did not move. And Steve Harvey, the host of the show, the man who had been holding this stage together for 14 years, simply stood there, frozen, processing what he had just heard. Then, slowly, his eyes moved. They moved off Reginald. They traveled past the buzzer, past the lineup of the Crawford children, all the way down to the far end of the lineup, where Yvette Crawford was still standing, perfectly still in her soft lavender dress. Steve's eyes found Yvette's eyes, and the look that passed between them in that next half-second was the look of one human being recognizing another human being in the middle of being broken in public. Steve Harvey lowered his blue card. He set it down on the small side table next to him. He did not pick it back up. He did not check the answer. He did not signal to the production crew. He turned his whole body toward Reginald Crawford. And in a voice that was not loud, not angry, not even raised, but that carried through the entire studio because of the quality of the silence around it, Steve Harvey said, "What did you just say?" Reginald's grin had started to slip. He could feel something happening that he did not understand. "Steve," he said with a smaller laugh, "just a joke, brother. Just a joke about my wife." Steve Harvey did not move. "Sir," he said again in the same quiet voice, "what did you just say?" He said each word as a complete sentence. The audience could hear every consonant. Reginald swallowed. "Well, I was saying, she was writing in her notebook last night, and apparently she has been thinking about moving out, and I I just thought, that was a surprising thing to find out. So, Steve Harvey nodded slowly. He turned his head and looked at Yvette. Again, Miss Yvette, he said gently. Yes, Mr. Harvey, Yvette whispered. Her voice was so soft the front row had to lean forward to hear her. Miss Yvette, did your husband just tell this audience that he read a private letter you wrote last night without your permission? Yvette did not answer right away. The camera zoomed in on her face. She looked at Reginald. She looked at her 3 children on the lineup. She looked at Steve Harvey. And then, very slowly, she nodded. Yes, Mr. Harvey, she said quietly. Yes, he did. The audience inhaled. Steve Harvey nodded again. Miss Yvette, he said, was that letter meant to be read by anybody other than you? Yvette shook her head slowly. No, Mr. Harvey, I was not finished writing it. It was on the desk in our hotel room. It was supposed to stay in my notebook until I was ready. Steve nodded. Miss Yvette, he said, did your husband just share the contents of that letter on national television without your permission? Yvette closed her eyes. The first tear ran down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. Yes, Mr. Harvey, she said. Yes, he did. The studio was completely silent. The Henley family across the stage had not moved in over a minute. Reginald was staring at his hands on the buzzer. His grin was completely gone now. The associate pastor smile he had been wearing all morning had been replaced by the slack, the pale expression of a man who had just realized, in the worst possible setting, that he had finally done the thing he could not undo. Steve Harvey walked across the stage. He walked past Reginald without looking at him. He walked the length of the Crawford family lineup, past Simone, past Naomi, past Christopher, and he stopped in front of Yvette Crawford. He did not touch her. He did not reach for her hand. He simply stood in front of her, his eyes level with hers, and he spoke to her in a voice that the audience could barely. Here, Miss Yvette, Steve said, I want you to listen to me, because I do not think anybody has said this to you in a long time. The things you write in a notebook at 2 o'clock in the morning in your own hotel room belong to you. They do not belong to your husband. They do not belong to his church. They do not belong to this audience. They do not belong to me. They belong to you. Do you hear me? Yvette nodded slowly. The tears were running freely down her face now, but she was not sobbing. She was crying the way nurses cry, quietly and steadily, without making a sound. Steve continued. Miss Yvette, I am not going to ask you what was in that letter. I am not going to ask you what you decided. I am not going to ask you anything about your marriage, your private life, your thoughts, your prayers, or your plans. None of that is my business. None of that is this audience's business. None of that is your husband's business either, unless you choose to make it so. And when you choose, Miss Yvette, you choose. Nobody chooses for you. Yvette nodded again. She could not speak. Steve turned slowly, finally, and faced Reginald Crawford. Reginald was already crying. His face was wet. His shoulders were shaking. Sir Steve said. His voice was no longer quiet. It was not loud either. It was the voice of a man who had been holding his composure for almost a full minute and who was now ready to use it. Sir, you are a pastor. Reginald nodded. Yes, Steve. Sir, you stand in front of a congregation every Sunday and you tell them how to live their lives. Yes, Steve, sir. Do you know what the word betrayal means? Reginald's mouth opened. No sound came out. Steve continued. Because what you just did to your wife, in front of your 3 children, in front of this audience, in front of every person who is going to watch this episode at home, is the dictionary definition of that word. You took something that did not belong to you. You held it up in front of millions of people and you turned it into a joke. Sir, that is not a marriage. That is not Christian. That is not pastoral. That is not even decent. Reginald was sobbing now, his head bowed. Steve Harvey did not raise his voice once. He simply kept talking. In the same level, deliberate cadence. Sir, I want you to look at your children. Reginald slowly raised his head. He looked at Simone, who was looking at her father with an expression that was no longer recognition. He looked at Naomi, whose hands were over her mouth. He looked at Christopher, the 16-year-old, who was crying openly and who had moved 2 steps closer to his mother on the lineup. Sir, Steve said, those 3 young people just found out their mother is leaving in June, not from their mother, not from their father in a private family conversation, but from a game show. Sir, can you tell me honestly on national television how you are going to apologize for that? Reginald could not answer. He could not get a word out. He simply stood there at the buzzer, crying, his head shaking back and forth as if he was trying to wake himself up from something. Steve Harvey turned to the producers in the booth. He held up one hand. He said into his microphone. "We are stopping this taping right now. The Crawford family is going to leave this stage. We will figure out the rest of this game on our own." The producers did not argue. The director called for a cut. The cameras did not stop rolling. Steve Harvey turned back to the Crawford family. "Miss Yvette," he said, "you and your 3 children can come with me. There is a private room backstage where you can sit down and have a moment. The Henley family is going to wait. The audience is going to wait. Everybody is going to wait. Because what just happened on this stage is more important than any survey question." Yvette nodded. She stepped down from the lineup. Her 3 children stepped down with her. Christopher reached his mother first, and he wrapped his arms around her with the kind of hug a teenage son gives his mother when he is finally tall enough to do it the right way. Simone and Naomi came next. The 4 of them walked off the stage together, Steve Harvey walking quietly a few feet behind them, his hand resting lightly on Christopher's shoulder. Reginald Crawford was left standing alone at the buzzer. The episode aired 5 weeks later. The producers had debated for 3 of those weeks about whether to air the segment at all. Steve Harvey had once again walked into the executive producer's office and said, very quietly, that the segment was going to air exactly as it had happened, with nothing cut, or he was going to walk off the show and not come back. The segment aired, unedited. The clip of Steve Harvey freezing for 11 seconds was viewed over 95 million times on social media in the first week. The clip of him saying the things you write in a notebook belong to you was quoted in newspaper columns, women's magazines, and counseling sessions across the country. A clinical psychologist on a national morning show called it the most clearly articulated public statement about marital privacy that had ever been broadcast on American daytime television. A women's organization in Baltimore named Yvette their Woman of the Year. She did not attend the ceremony. She sent a quiet letter of thanks and asked them, gently, to give the award to somebody who needed it more. Yvette Crawford moved out of the Crawford family home in early June, exactly as her unfinished letter had said she would. She did not file for divorce right away. She told her daughters, in a long conversation around her own mother's old kitchen table, that she was not ready to make that decision yet, that she needed time to figure out who she was when she was not the wife of an associate pastor. Simone and Naomi told her they understood. Christopher, the 16-year-old, had asked to come with her. Yvette had let him. They had rented a small 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood near the hospital where she worked. Christopher had transferred to a different high school for his senior year. He had told his mother, on the second night they had spent in the new apartment, that he was proud of her. Yvette had cried for almost an hour. Christopher had sat next to her on the small couch in the living room and had not said anything. He had simply been there. Reginald Crawford stepped down from his associate pastor position at his church the Sunday after the episode aired. He did not preach a farewell sermon. He did not give an interview. He simply met with the senior pastor on a Saturday morning, handed in his resignation, and walked out of the building he had served in for 22 years. The senior pastor announced the resignation to the congregation the next morning, without going into details, but the congregation had already seen the episode. The episode had been shared in the Sunday school classes, in the lobby, in the parking lot. Many of the women in the congregation, women who had heard Yvette's private stories from the pulpit for years, called Yvette in the weeks that followed. They apologized. They told her they had not understood what they were hearing. They told her they had thought it was testimony, when actually it had been something else entirely. Yvette received those calls graciously. She did not blame the congregation. She told them she did not blame them, and she meant it. Reginald started therapy. He started it the week the episode aired, not because Yvette had asked him to, but because his own sister, who had watched the episode from her kitchen in North Carolina, had called him and told him that if he did not get help, she was done with him too. Reginald had listened. He had found a Christian counselor in Baltimore who specialized in clergy ethics. He had been going twice a week for the past 4 months by the time the follow-up segment was filmed. 1 year later, Family Feud invited Yvette back for a follow-up appearance. She came on alone, in the same soft lavender dress, though the dress was now a little looser on her than it had been the year before. She told Steve Harvey, sitting across from him on the same stage where it had all happened, that she and Reginald were not back together, but that they were talking. She told him she had filed for legal separation in October but had not yet decided about divorce. She told him she had started a small support group at the hospital where she worked, a quiet group for nurses and other women who had spent their careers caring for other people while quietly being killed. Uncared for themselves, the group met every other Wednesday in a small conference room on the labor and delivery floor. They did not advertise. They did not have a name. They simply met. And the group had grown from 4 nurses the first month to 27 by the end of the year. Steve Harvey shook his head slowly. "Miss Yvette," he said, "you did not just take your private life back. You showed every woman watching this country what taking it back looks like." Yvette smiled, the small, careful smile her mother had taught her. But this time, like Lorraine before her, and Cheryl, and Eleanor, and Denise, the smile finally reached her eyes, and somewhere in a small 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood in Baltimore, on a cool spring evening with the kitchen window open just enough to catch the early March air, a 17-year-old boy named Christopher sat at his mother's kitchen table doing his homework, while his mother sat across from him in her nurse's scrubs, reading a book she had wanted to read for years but had never had the time. Neither of them was talking. Neither of them needed to. The notebook that Yvette had been writing in that night in Atlanta sat closed on the kitchen counter. It was hers. It had always been hers, and nobody ever again would open it without her permission.